So when we look at it, we really realize it's not just a technical problem. It was just not simply we burning carbons, our very naive, innocent actions that led us here. It was actually a very well thought out and even intentional process that could lead us here. And that's why when we talk about the climate crisis, we cannot not talk about capitalism.
Next up is our guest speaker, Tonny Nowshin. She's a development professional. She has worked with several NGOs, and she's also an advocate for decolonial, degrowth, as well as anti-racist and climate justice perspectives. Today, she will speak about capitalistic structures in our systems and how we can fight those. We're looking forward to your speech a lot. Ms. Nowshin, the stage is yours.
Thank you so much. I will start by sharing my screen quickly. Is it working? Could you see?
Yes, it does. Thanks.
Good. Okay, I'll start with this question. Why talk about capitalism while talking about climate crisis? So what is climate crisis? I think we already know quite well from my previous speaker's wonderful presentation. It was discussed quite in detail. So the reasons for climate change, I will just run through a tiny bit of basics, as we all know already. CO2 and what are the sources of CO2? Basically, a lot of the other gases, but one of them, the one most prominent is, of course, CO2 particles in the atmosphere. And then the sources of the CO2, we know are many different sectors, including transport, agriculture, industrial production, and one big chunk is, of course, the fossil fuel extraction and burning of fossil fuels. And what does it look like? What it means? So who shares the responsibility of this carbon emission? This map from Carbon Map, Our World in Data shows the areas of the world that has historically emitted more carbons are bloated here. And we would see these are the areas that were the early industrialized nations who had the first production, systemic economic production that was organized in industrialized ways, or we call it the early capitalist systems. And when we look into the people who are more at risk from the climate crisis, we see a different, completely a different part of the world. That's mostly what we also call often global south. In this case, one thing to remember is when we talk about global north and global south, we do not or the sociologist who came up, we termed the coin global south and global north. The idea was to step away from the earlier terms that was used as first world country, second world country, and third world country. So kind of really dismantle that hierarchical idea and focus on a more non-value term. So that's how the global north and global south came. So it's not always refers to the geographical area that sometimes we mistake. So from this map, what we see is a huge, the largest people who are at risk from climate crisis are heavily concentrated on a very different part of the world than the ones that are responsible for climate change. And from here, what we get a bit of idea that the early industrialized nations and the economies that were organizing differently were the ones who are emitting a lot of carbon. This one shows what climate crisis would mean for different parts of the world. This shows, this is a data taken from the World Bank, and it shows how the agricultural production would also change due to climate crisis by 2050. And here we see that in sub-Saharan regions, in different parts in South America, the agricultural production would go down by 50%. And in some regions, actually the production would even increase. What does all of this mean? We already knew that the climate change is happening already from the early 19th century. And even though we knew how did we arrive here, how come we have been continuing on the path? If you remember some of the projections that was shared before, that we knew that if we are continuing on this way, we would be facing a global average temperature rise of even 3 to 4 degrees. But we were not doing enough to change that. And one of the funniest, or even not funny, what would be more accurate term is the most ironic thing, is actually the biggest fossil fuel company, Exxon. Their scientists already found out that the reasons this fossil fuel burning and the fossil fuel extraction are the reasons for climate change, and we would end up where we are today. But what they did was completely different than what they found out. So the scientists of Exxon told that this is how we are causing global warming, and specifically the fossil fuel burning and the way we are channeling all our activities and all our energy system around fossil fuel. And what they did was they started funding, they started channeling money into funds to make sure that there are misconceptions and the ideas about the climate change are not accurate. So they were pouring money into fight the scientists who are trying to say the true reasons for climate change. At the same time, they were also even trying to create misinformation and stop any kind of government action inside the different spaces, discussion spaces. So when we stop and think that how the system that was producing, that was responsible for the climate change, for the way the carbons were burning, and the system that already knew, but which allowed for these big companies to keep on doing their work and at the same time channel money instead of really taking action to stop it, they were trying to protect their businesses. Then we realized that it was in the core, the capitalist system that was allowing for this to happen. It was about, again, this profit before people, profit before humans. That was the thought, that was the main idea, and that's how we could arrive there. So when we look at it, we really realize it's not just a technical problem. It was just not simply we burning carbons, our very naive, innocent actions that led us here. It was actually a very well thought out and even intentional process that could lead us here. And that's why when we talk about the climate crisis, we cannot not talk about capitalism. And that's why I want to say that climate crisis is created by capitalism. It is not a technical crisis. Climate crisis is a social justice issue. And why do we talk about, when we say so that climate crisis is a social justice issue, what does that, when we try to further unpack it, where do we arrive? So climate crisis and colonialism, this is where we arrive. Because when we try to unpack the capitalist history of the today's world order, where we are, how did we arrive here? So this is also, now we are trying to dig deeper. Then how did Exxon ended up having so much power that they could really keep on doing what they wanted to do, and they could really keep on spreading misinformation and protect their power? This is where we will go back into the history of kind of how, what economic system allowed for certain smaller different companies to gather so much power all over the world. So we look back and we see that there is a history of colonial exploitation that around for the whole money and wealth of the whole world get centralized into certain parts of the world, into the hands of the few. So that's why when we talk about today's world order and today's economic system, we cannot not talk about colonialism. We have to look into the background and the history that allowed for this centralized system. This image shows just the idea of how this talks about the whole Africa and the whole South America that was taken over, plundered to take over wealth and create the way for these certain companies to arise. There is a certain global world order in which we today exist. And in this world order, global South countries are embedded in a specific relationship with global North countries. There is a historical carbon emission, as if you remember my first slide when we were talking about then this whole carbon emission, there are certain parts of the world, there are certain way of production, and there are certain regions that are producing way more carbon than other parts. That means there is a historical responsibility that has piled up over the years. And then this slide is to explain a bit about the process of how we arrived. So then again, unpacking a little bit more about this system that has allowed and that has made way for where we are today. So if you think about how did this whole thing again allowed for, we see that development in the North has happened through a process of mineral accumulation from different parts of the world. It has happened through slave trade. It has happened through dominance over domestic markets of different global South countries. Minerals were accumulated from South America, from Africa. There were black bodies were taken away from whole African continent over hundreds and hundreds of years. There were pushed products that were sold, pushed into the whole Indian subcontinent. They had their own market, they had their own local producers, but the colonizers, for example, that we know that the British were ruling India for, again, 300 years, and they would destroy the local producers, and they would really force the local people to buy goods that were not even good in quality from that was being produced in the big factories in Britain, in UK. Development and other parts we know is that there were corporate dominance over national markets that happened then as a continuation of this way. When the dominance was established, then these different corporate groups were taking over the national markets through their products. And at the same time, we see through the trades, there were shifted terms of trade. Through also, we know over time with the World Bank and IMF, there are different rules. It was established that the capital could move freely wherever they would see higher return, but the people could not travel. So the good and capital could move freely, but it was always different when it was about people. And all of this was done at a very carbon-intensive based economy. So once we unpack all this history, what we realize that there has been a long-term colonial relationship that has allowed for this system to persist, and that system has allowed us to arrive where we are. So kind of the climate crisis is a culmination of the historical colonial exploitation. And today, this colonial relationship is still continuing. We would, this is one of the data taken from Global Financial Integrity Report that shows that often the aid that goes in even the global South countries, from 18 to 24 times more of that aid flows back out of those countries. So even today, the relationship, these colonial relationships are continuing, and those are masked behind names of aid. Then the money that flows out of those countries are in the shape of interest payments, multinational company profits, and illicit financial outflows. And that brings us to the point of green colonialism. Then, if we try to think that, okay, we can solve climate crisis, and for that, when we look at climate crisis, just a technical issue, we would think then, okay, we just need to fix energy, the way we use energy, and we just need to move away from not using fossil fuels. Then it's possible, then we would be able to solve it. And this is the point to then we start and we say, no, we won't be able to solve climate crisis if you look at it just as a technical issue. If we don't talk about capitalism, we will end up just having green colonialism and green capitalism. What would that mean? So these are some examples that shows that how the eco-girds, this is one example taken by a news, that how the eco-girds funded by WWF are beating up the people who lives near those forests, who have been living there and who has the right, who are dependent on the forest for their own livelihood. But because these new ideas of protecting nature, what is happening now, these countries or these powerful, even sometimes NGOs from global north are going to the global south and changing and stopping the relationship of the people. And this is being done in the name of protection, environmental protection. We know how this is talking about some of the windmills when that is taken away land from the Sami people, the local indigenous people in Norway. And the third example is how the lithium battery, because lithium battery is one of the most important things when we're talking about a transition, a green renewables transition. And because of we expect that lithium would become it's getting already higher in demand. And this is already given a rising crisis and conflict in the areas where there are lithium mines. So when we look into all of this situation, what we realize is unless we look into the relationship of the way we produce things and the way our economic and social justice issues are, unless we take into the consideration of even when we're discussing about climate crisis and we look at the climate crisis as a culmination of all of the already existing social injustices, we won't be able to solve it if we will just keep making the same mistakes and reproducing same kind of power dynamics in the future as well. So how do we want to go forward? This is where it would seem like, okay, you're just giving some straightforward, simple answers, Tony. These are, how do we really want to go forward? I would say, of course, we have to demand for system change. We have to talk about degrowth. We have to talk about decolonization. We have to talk about global solidarity. But how, when we say that, isn't it too difficult? Isn't it then too broad? And how can we even approach that? Here, one of the thing is, I would say that system change, what might come as a daunting task, what we see now is, as the face of the climate change is forcing us to really rethink our relationship with the world. It's really forcing us to rethink how we live, how we produce, and how we maintain the whole social structures and all the social contracts. And this is exactly, when we look into all the projection, you already saw the IPCC projections at the moment, and we are seeing from our experience from the last 2-3 years being on the street, demanding the governments and all the people who are in the power to really do what's necessary. We already know how difficult it has been, and when we stop and think why it is so difficult, it should be really, what should be really common sense, what we are all realizing needs to be done at the moment. Why is it still so difficult? When we are facing an existential threat, when we are facing an existential crisis, why are we not being to change our old ways of living? That kind of brings into the answer of, like, this is not so simple, probably, of course, the talking about whole system change and changing the whole power dynamics and the status quo. For that, the most important thing I want to say is that it's being aware to know what's the correct narrative is. We have to start talking about that we want to move away. These are the things we cannot make compromises. And the second thing is we have to start from what we need to start making changes from what we have existing already, and we need to go as radical as we can go. So degrowth is one way that we need to keep talking about degrowth, because we cannot keep talking about growth and think we will be able to solve the climate crisis. I see my time is already run out. I would try to summarize in the ways that the point is, when we are talking about with the today's projection and what we are facing, we have to let our imagination go most radical, because what we realize already, unless we are ready to go for radical, broader changes, we won't be able to solve the climate crisis and move away from it. So for that, this is where we have to have the vision, and we have to keep pushing for the biggest changes that we can demand for. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tony, for this speak and for these insights into how capitalism relates to climate change. And thank you so much for highlighting that it's not about profit before people, but people before profit. And climate crisis is a social justice issue. Thank you so much for highlighting this. I hope everyone is aware of this right now. And also thanks for highlighting the system change that is needed. We have collected questions again on Tweetback, and the guests want to know, what would you recommend to make big companies take up responsibility for their actions? Fines alone won't matter that much for those companies.
If you look into what is happening at the moment, we should really make all those companies, we need to make all of those completely liquidate those companies, because it's really, they are cashing out on our planet. If you start even finding in a way that we start saying, if a typhoon is hitting Philippines, it needs to be Exxon must pay for all the damages that's happening at the moment now. So it's really, we need to start talking about going after them in a way that you have been cashing out our planet at the moment and also our future. So of course the fines would not matter in a way, because the amount of money they're making, we cannot even connect to the amount of damage that's happening. But at the same time, if we realize that we cannot have both at the same time, this company exists and we have a future, a sustainable future that does not go hand in hand, this is only right that we start demanding, if the governments are listening to us when we're thinking about an energy transition, that would mean all the investments, all the money and all the finances that we have now needs to move towards a renewable structure. And that would also mean that we need to take away also money from all of these companies. We should declare all these companies bankrupt, and we need to just take them over and really start using that money to pay for the communities that are facing damages, to start paying for the new jobs that we would need to make the transition happen at the moment. So in this, again, I would say I would love to go completely radical. I would say we need to abolish all of these companies. We need to completely take them over and kind of really use all their stakes and their money towards a rather completely green and other forms of energy and all forms of helping communities sustain and adapt. So would rather go that direction, not for a fine.
Yes, all right. Thanks a lot for your opinion on this question. We also do have the time to ask a second question, so we want to take advantage of that, of course. The second question would be, how can we ensure an economic development in a less industrialized country or countries with renewable energy? Can you give us insights on that as well?
Yeah, so for example, specifically, I can talk about, for the example of Bangladesh, that we know we were being forced to make coal power plants, whereas we don't need any coal power plants. And government had this plan for making 27 new coal power plants from our energy need, and also the feasibility that the amount of sun we have, the amount of wind and the seashore access we have. There was, even from the movement side, there was proposed a alternative energy plan by the people that was proposed to counter all these power plants and the coal power plants, and showing that it's completely possible to even have a huge energy growth and completely do it from renewable sources. And the problem has been, even though we have some of the technologies, and even though we have the possibilities and the demand, and the people are also willing to go for that, nobody wants coal power plant. What was happening was, again, as you remember from the example of Exxon I showed you at the beginning, again, it was the lobby power. It was a lot of different international companies, a lot of different international money, and this coal lobbying that was trying to find their last bit of money, and they were ending up in Bangladesh. So one of the good things now recently happened is out of the 27 power plants, 22 got canceled. And now, due to a long-standing movement from the civil society and from different international community, the banks even who were financing coal power plants now are slowly moving. So these are some of the good things that's at the moment happening. So the investors are also thinking that, okay, they don't want to finance in coal anymore. So these are the small changes that's happening. And we also see in these cases, there was also one German company that was involved with this coal power plant building. And this again shows how these relationships are hidden between the global supply chain, because this Fischner, this company, German company here in Germany, they pretend to be a very green company. They try to, in their own city in Stuttgart, they pretend that they're a renewables, they're only generating good technology, but at the same time, they are also trying to sell and make money from coal businesses in other parts of the world. So I think one of the good things we can see is when these relationships are being exposed, when there is more awareness, there's more civil society demand, these companies are being now forced to move away. So one of the simple thing is, if the finances are there, if there is interest and this lobbying. So if this lobbying didn't exist, it would be much more easy for any of the global south countries to even go for a renewable shift. We need to make sure that the technology is being shared without any patent, without any conditionality. The finances are not going behind this coal or dirty old energy things. And also at the same time, that we are not using this lobby power, are not dictating how a energy or how a country should be using energy, because that has been one of the biggest challenges at the moment all over. Like also here in all of the cases, we see again this lobby and these powerful groups again and again. So we already have got a lot of alternative energy. People are ready to go for it. We really need to then. So this, I would say, also again an example of win of civil society and the movements that we see in the case of Bangladesh, and we probably need to then try to replicate it and do it more and make it more clearer, these relationships and its demands.
All right, thanks a lot for your answer, and thanks a lot for creating awareness tonight. We hope you can still enjoy the rest of the night, lean back and listen to the upcoming keynotes. Thanks a lot, Ms. Nowshin.